Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. Today, there is an exciting episode with Hunt Priest and Jessica Felix Romero. I'm going to talk a little bit about them and then get some housekeeping details and get started. So in this episode of The Sacred Speaks podcast, we explore the potential of the Christian church as a sanctuary for psychedelic healing. Our guests, Hunt Priest and Jessica Felix Romero, seek to reconnect the worlds of psychedelics and organized religion. Addressing the misinformation that has driven them apart for the past 50 years, they assert that the church must prioritize healing and work to rectify the damage caused by this discontent. And it's a cool episode, calling it Psychedelic Christians. And I now want to introduce you to Hunt through his bio and Jessica. Hunt Priest is a priest in the Episcopal Church and the founding executive director of Ligare, a Christian psychedelic society, a nonprofit network of Christian leaders educating themselves and those they lead about the intersection of open-hearted Christianity and the psychedelic renaissance. A participant in a psilocybin study in early 2016, he had two life-changing mystical experiences under the care of a research team. His encounter with psilocybin opened him to the healing and consciousness-raising power of psychedelic medicines and changed the landscape of his work. Hunt believes the healing power of psychedelics should be in the toolkits of all who are healers of bodies, minds, and souls, and can't wait to be part of the providing legal, safe access for guiding experience in a Christian setting. In April 2021, Hunt took an extended break from a full-time parish ministry to expand his priesthood out into the emerging psychedelic landscape. Jessica Felix Romero has over 16 years of experience in social justice advocacy, organizing, and communications. With a doctorate in conflict analysis and resolution, she integrates holistic systems analysis and transformative design to help nonprofits advance social change. She is vice president and chief strategy and impact officer at Sojourners, a faith-inspired nonprofit that works with Christians to put their faith into action in the passionate pursuit of social justice, peace, and environmental stewardship. Jessica loves all things about food and spirituality. Her pioneering doctoral research in El Salvador documents the transformational possibilities of conflict resolution-oriented food systems that feed people and nurture peace. She's a student of somatic writing and practitioner of embodied leadership. Her current work explores the intersection of spirituality, ancestral wisdom, psychedelics, and Christianity. It's a great conversation. Thank you both, Hunt and Jessica, for participating. And it was so informative and especially great to put the two words Christian and psychedelic together. So to some housekeeping details. I'd, of course, like you all to know about a class I'm teaching at the Jung Center. As you know, the Jung Center is one of my favorite places, and I'm going to find here somewhere. So the class, sorry for the delay, class is called Promethean Visions, Unraveling the Psyche Through Myth, Religion, and Psychedelics. It's 4 Wednesdays at the Jung Center. You can reach that at junghouston.org here in Houston, June 7th through 28th. 6 to 7:30 p.m. Central Time. Join us for an illuminating exploration of myth, religion, and the burgeoning field of psychedelic-assisted therapies. Delving into the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, we'll engage with the idea that the healing power of psychedelics must be approached with reverence, mindfulness, and respect for their sacred nature. Drawing on Carl Jung's groundbreaking insights into the human psyche, as well as contemporary research on psychedelics, and the mystical experience they can evoke, we will investigate the importance of integrating sacred and religious paradigms into psychedelic-assisted therapy. Together, we will engage in thought-provoking discussions and activities that will help us understand the role of psychedelics in modern spirituality and mental health, and embark on a journey to discover the profound insights and transformative power hidden within the Promethean myth and the world of psychedelic-assisted therapies. Another few series of cool episodes coming out. Next week, I'll release an episode with Deborah Mouton where we talk about her book, Black Chameleon. And then the following week will be an interview with Rachel Harris where we talk about her book, Swimming in the Sacred. Got a lot of great stuff coming up next month. Mary Casamano from Johns Hopkins. We've got Thomas More, James Hollis, and I am so eager to get into that. So, couple other updates. Esalen, we've got a week booked at Esalen in October on ecstatic experience music and Jung's Red Book. That's a repeat from our earlier workshop in March, late February, early March. So check them out at esalen.org. As always, the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative practice that my wife and I created here in Houston. Check us out at thecenterforhas.com. Then the music of the podcast is created by Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. And the song is Clouds, which I love. And also check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. And I think that does it as far as updates are concerned. A lot going on. You're going to be getting a lot of episodes. And also, a lot of episodes coming out. Great interviews. Looking forward to the next few months. I'll keep the material pumping. And thanks for being here. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your engagement. Please share. Please share all that you can and desire to. That's how the organic growth is spread. So thank you for your support. Thank you for being here. And enjoy the episode. For now, we'll leave it there. So we are here. Hunt and Jessica, I'm eager for you guys to introduce yourselves, and we've already been getting into a spirited conversation. Jessica, you're bringing a fire that I really like and I'm excited about. So, and it, just so you know, as the listener out there, it's difficult for me every time I meet with folks because there's so much juice in our introductory conversations before we hit record. So we're already a little high off this, and I'm looking forward to seeing where we go. So Jessica, Felix, Romero, and Hunt Priest, I'm glad to have you guys here. I want you to introduce yourself, let everybody know what y'all are up to, and then we'll kind of dive into our conversation. And Hunt, why do you start? Just let folks know.
Sure. Hunt Priest. I live in Savannah, Georgia. It's confusing because my name is the same as my vocation or job. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church. It's very confusing to people, but it is actually my name. I was ordained at 40, so second career. I've served churches in Austin, Atlanta, Seattle, and now Savannah, Georgia, where we live. When I lived in Seattle, I was part of a research study with clergy and psilocybin, part of some ongoing research about mental health and the power of healing with psychedelics, and that was in 2016. And 2 years ago, I decided it was time to take a break from parish work, not to leave it, but to take a break from it, to keep my ordination as a priest intact and work in this arena of networking and educating Christians and the general public about the healing potential and spiritual growth potential of safe and legal use of psychedelics. I was given an incredible gift to be part of that study, had transformative experiences that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. And I want that available to as many people, to anyone that wants it and is a good candidate for it. And
Great.
We're moving into new territory. And I think the Christian tradition and practice and ritual and community has a place in this conversation. So that's why I'm here.
And quickly, Ligare was a name that occurred a couple of times in the podcast. Michael Winkleman mentioned your work, and then Bill Barnard mentioned your work. And so then to connect with you in this way is really exciting because our lives are really interwoven. And then you've introduced me to a fireball of spirit in Jessica. Now, Jessica, would you take a couple of minutes and let everyone know who you are?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Jessica Felix Romero. I am just delighted to be having this conversation. I've kind of come to this space. I'm located in Leesburg, Virginia, which is the land of the Monohoic peoples. And I have been on a quest for quite some time. I've been working around faith groups. I have a doctorate in conflict analysis and resolution. So I really come to this work with a heart for peace building, justice work. I've worked formally in my career over 20 years now in social justice movements, both in the labor movement and then doing farm worker rights, food, sustainability, peace building, helping do trauma healing, post-war contexts. Then all of a sudden, I kind of came to this moment of understanding how could the church become more vital in the world today. I was sort of doing it outside in the nonprofit world and really looking at the power of narrative and communications. and how we can motivate people to do things. And I had a home practice of having a group of people I met with and going to a church. And yet that wasn't where I was doing my social justice work. And I found that most of the time it wasn't really welcomed when I was in social justice spaces. And so I moved into a second part of my career of sort of saying, how could we actually show up as people of faith, as good neighbors to social justice movements, and really have these conversations to ourselves? How do we reflect on where the church is as an institution and how we are as communities, and really diversifying the church experience? So I love working with Hunt. I am the board chair of Ligare. And, so we have Hunt as sort of the master of the pew, the pulpit, and I'm the sort of the rabble rouser in the pew. I want to ask the questions. I want to know what's happening. I want to challenge the idea of where power and where the authority of our own spiritual lives comes from. So I'm kind of a mix of, I love the traditional church and the structure and the spaces that it's given me to grow and the tools it's given me. And I want to see it expand. I want it to be at its flourishing best. And I know that happens when we center all of the lived experiences that is possible. So I come to the work both in psychedelics in that space. I took a formal role in leadership in the faith movement, in the Christian space movement. I work in an organization called Sojourners, and they work at the intersection of faith, culture, and politics. So you can imagine I have a lot of experience doing work and sort of how to have people who are of faith, Christians, or people who have a Christian heritage, may have left the church, but they grew up with these ideas and they grew up with this orientation, and they still care about social justice and want to find a bridge. So I do a lot of that bridge building work through our work at Sojourners. And in that moment, I found that there weren't a lot of female leaders. I was kind of one of the few. And at the time, I was looking at very different types of leadership that was possible. And I was experiencing a very specific type of probably would call traditional male-dominated faith leadership. And I wanted to bring something different. And so I started studying embodied leadership, started exploring the divine feminine. And in that path, I came across and was able to be held in a container where I first was able to ingest and work with sacred plant medicines. And that was over 6 years ago now. And it's been part of my ongoing spiritual practice. And I think one of the biggest surprises is that it's deepened my faith in a way that I didn't expect. A lot of times I meet people and they feel like they're going sort of outside Christianity to have this experience. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh no, this is when the deepest wells of your faith are like what you're going to be pulling on when you're in these liminal realms. And so I kind of sit at that nexus of bridging both what does leadership look like, what does embodied leadership look like, what does a vibrant socially just and orient church look like, and then what do we have on our own individual spiritual development and how those can all flow together.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. This is fun. So let's dive in. And I think that maybe the first thing we need to talk about is, I don't know, when you two do these kinds of conversations, how do you like to start this? Because I want to start with the church, but then I also feel like we need to start with experience, like what we're talking about. So you guys guide us for a minute. Where do you tend to like to begin orienting people in this work that you're doing?
Jessica, we can figure it out. I like talking about experience first because I think that's where it's not just where the meat is, but that's where religion begins and our spiritual life begins is with our own experience. So let's
go with that, Hunt.
I love that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Tell us about that, Hunt. No easy task, right?
You're up.
I'll talk about my experience in mystical spaces and with mystical experiences, psychedelics being part of that in this beginning at 52, so 8 years ago. So I've always been always kind of had that orientation. I think as a little kid, I would not walk on plants because I felt like I knew they had lives and feelings, and so I've just always I've seen nature as I've always understood nature to be where God reveals God's self. And I was just kind of oriented that way anyway, which I think makes sense that eventually one of the routes would be to ordination and trying to lead other people to that space. So I went to seminary at 37, ordained at 40 because I had these profound experiences in nature, in church, often in liturgy, baptisms, communion. So so I went to seminary and was ordained and started working in the church, and pretty quickly lost a lot of sense of mysticism, and
Mm.
because it's an institution and it has to have structure, and there has to be a plan, and there has to be a vision and all that, which is important. But leading a church community for 12 years or so, my sense of the mystical and frankly my experiences of God began to diminish as I was
Mm.
working to keep an institution up. The church was already in decline, and lots of people were finding their spirituality in other places, and there's just lots of pressure on clergy and church leaders, not just clergy, but church leaders. So that's where I was, and I saw an ad in Christian Century for a study involving religious professionals of all traditions. And I thought, why in the world would I not do that? So I applied, was accepted. Within 3 months, I was with two guides at a research institution and given over the course of a month 2 different doses of psilocybin, and had very profound religious experiences. One was a very Pentecostal experience of speaking in tongues and an energetic flow in my body, and the laying on of hands by one of my guides, which just escalated the energy that was in my body. Mm-hmm. And after that 6-hour session, this pretty big ball of anxiety that I've been carrying around was gone. I realized the next morning it was so much worse. I realized after it was gone. So both a very Pentecostal experience, which is unusual for an Episcopal priest, not unheard of, but unusual, had that, and then had a healing because of something I'd done a million times, which is to lay hands on people. I was open. The psilocybin opened me to many experiences. And then the second time, a month later, I had the completion of my ordination to the priesthood. I say at the feet of the universe. So beyond the experience of at the feet of the bishop in an Episcopal church, but out in this very cosmic way, prayerfully and submitting myself to it in a way that I hadn't done the first round of ordination. I submitted myself to God and the universe in a whole new way. And so very religious experiences, very Christian experiences. Not everyone has those, but I did. And like I said a minute ago, I want that available to everyone that is open to it and is a candidate for it. There are some contraindications, but I think this is should be available to as many people that want it and are healthy. So,
Hun, I got a question here, because as you're talking, I'm projecting onto people out there watching, which is, holy shit, this guy in a collar is talking about psilocybin. And I'm thinking, like, why is that weird? So, because as when we three were talking earlier, and I was sharing how this workshop that I just led with a colleague, Rodney Waters, that what we were really looking at is how every institutionalized religion has at its core some ecstatic religious experience, we could say. Mm-hmm. And then the institutions formed around that experience. So the fact that it's weird or odd or seems out of place for a clergy member to be talking about taking a substance to meet or connect with God, why do you think that's weird? What do you say about that?
I don't know. Well, I think it's 50 years of bad information around psychedelics. That's part of it. Politicized, terrible, unscientific information about psychedelics. So there's that. And I think the healing, it's documented, and the church must care about healing. Even if it's nothing else, the church has to care about healing.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that.
I think, and in Christianity, not all parts of Christianity, but in most Christian communities and most Christian communions, we do ingest a substance. We ingest bread and wine into our bodies to have an encounter with God, and it's forgotten, and we don't do a great job of making that connection for people. But the Christian tradition is based on an ingestion of a substance, unless you're Methodist, a mind-altering substance. So, yeah. I mean, in enough quantity, wine, that's so. It shouldn't be, and yet the subtitle of Ligare is a Christian psychedelic society, and I frankly picked that for one reason, because it's provocative, and you don't see those words together. So that's part of what we're trying to wake people up to it and to normalize it. I mean, I don't wear my collar all the time, but when I'm talking about this, I do, because this is not outside the bounds of Orthodox Christianity, even though people might think it is. Sure.
Yeah, that's a good sentence right there to hang on to. This is not outside the bounds of, yes. Yeah, agreed. Well, Jessica, why don't you dive into that? Talk a little bit about the experiential dimension of this, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about your relationship and how you work together and what you're trying to do, what your objectives are, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Great. Yeah, I'll just say right now, I always seeing Hunt on a screen talking with the caller, talking about this, always is an encouragement to me. It is like, it does something to me and my lived experience of Christianity. I just go like, oh. Like, right. And I think that often we don't give clergy the freedom to explore their own lives. As someone, at Sojourners formally, I great multi-million-dollar, programs where we're doing capacity building for clergy and on a topic or for themselves, or what's clergy renewal these days, and what is the thing. And we often don't allow that they're having their own experience. And so, Hunt is both representing to me at this moment when I see him, this is what I project, see him as the church and like, that positive male leadership. There is something wonderful about, someone that's in a collar and talking about what I think is a justice issue. And I celebrate seeing Hunt as a clergy person doing his work and having his exploration, because that's what we want. We want to be able, when we're vulnerable and we go to a clergy person or a healer, we want to know that they are in solidarity with us. We want to know that they're a real person, that they have gone through something, right? And so being able to have the fullness of experiences. I want Hunt to have joy, and I want him to have gone through suffering, and been on the other side of that. And so I think there's that too, where sometimes we don't, we only look to the clergy to hold the institution and the law, and they're embodied people, and we want them to have a flexibility and ability to grow. And so a lot of my work at Sojourners is about how do we revitalize the church by revitalizing those who hold up that institution. And so this is part of that. So my sideline on how great it is to look at Hunt. It's a therapy on many levels. But my sort of faith journey, I grew up going to sort of a Baptist style church. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but my parents are both from El Salvador. So I'm a very first generation. So I grew up definitely still in that very first generation immigrant experience. We went to a Baptist church. It was predominantly white. I had a good basis of understanding the Bible. We left that church when I was about 14 and went to more of a charismatic church, and then I ended up in a Pentecostal church. So I've had a bit of the experience, a little bit of the spectrum of both Christian experiences and theologies and doctrines. And so I have, like Hunt, I had a sensitivity, I think, to God since I was young. As I just said, I have a very beautiful relationship with my mother named Blanca, and she has a big faith. She had a really, she was orphaned when she was 3, and she really lived her life dependent on God as her parent. And so I grew up hearing about a God that was as big as the cosmos, but as specific as she had nothing to eat, and guided her to a tree to find a banana. And so I grew up in this idea of that God was so big and yet was so individual and knew each of us. So I really appreciated getting the foundation of understanding what this Christian faith path meant. And yet I had this squirrely, like, there's an independent lived experience. There's something that's unique about you and God, that only you can create by accepting that invitation. And it's an invitation. So I had both, like the individual and exploring, and an institutional. So that was really sort of my faith background coming in. As I was saying, I was working more formally as a faith leader about 5 or 6 years ago, and I hit a bit of a dry patch. I was in a job and I was like, this seems really perfect on paper. I'm like, influencing the church. I'm helping people talk about their faith. I'm doing things, and I was like, and I'm kind of dry inside. Something has happened, and that had never happened. I had never had that contraction in my life. I always really enjoyed my faith, and I was like, oh, something's happening here. So that's when I started looking about embodied leadership, the divine feminine, and was introduced into the sacred plant traditions. And for me, it's been, I'd say, almost 6 years, and it's definitely part of my own spiritual practice. I am very fortunate that I have the ability to travel and participate in circles, and so it is part of my spiritual life now, pretty consistently for the past 6 years. I also, in my very first ceremony, had a very big opening to the divine. Um, I had had a mystical experience when I was 26, long before all of this work, and it was, as someone would say, spontaneous. And I was, interestingly enough, I had been at a weekend where I was doing racial justice work, and I was doing racial justice training. It was the very first time I was really leaning into that work, and had a spontaneous sort of mystical experience, similar to sort of Thomas Merton, even though I had no idea who Thomas Merton was yet. And the world glowed. I, for 3 days, saw everything was shimmering in golden light. I just like tears running down my face. And it was that sort of, from the text in Psalms, it was like in Psalm 23, it was like my cup overflows. It was just this feeling of overflow of joy. And it lasted about 3 days, and it was significant. And yet I didn't sort of fully integrate it into my life. My life didn't change dramatically at that point. I was still working on my dissertation, building a career. It pretty much stayed the same, but it was something that definitely left an impression. So then when I had, my first experience with the plants, which would have been, almost 40, I was 40, almost turning 40 at that time. So a good chunk of time between, I definitely met the divine again. And I had this deep swelling in the moment of, I had this sort of, what I know from my sort of Pentecostal experience, what I call the prompting of the Holy Spirit. It's this quiet voice in my heart. And I saw a beautiful crystalline light. I felt this prompting in my spirit. And I had asked going in, what was my sacred vocation? That was my sort of intention going in. And sort of that soft voice I heard was, you are the embodiment of abundance. And in my head, even though I was in for the first time, this liminal realm, back in the back of my mind, I heard the scripture from John 10:10, where Jesus says, I come to give you life so that you can live it more abundantly. And in that moment, I realized I was tracking something. I was having this experience beyond anything I'd ever had. And yet I still had the ability to pull into and connect to a sacred text and make sense of what I was feeling. And my entire body, every cell, my body was in abundance and overflowing. That was an absolutely new north experience for me. And what it did is I was like, oh my goodness, this is who I am. I could feel myself in my body for the first time. And it gave me a radical love for me. I'd been very used to, fighting for justice, advocating for others, showing up for my family, but I didn't love probably myself as radically as I loved and stood for others. In that moment of feeling my body come online, so to speak, and that abundance and saying, that's what you are, I was like, whew, I'm never going to violate that. It gave me a way of being like, I was able to start putting myself first in a very healthy way. And that sort of opened the door to continue. I said, I want to know more about this work. And I've continued to sort of do that. And so as I said in my intro, I found that it's deepened my faith. For me, it's opened up a lot of understanding the energetics of Christianity. I have a really good Bible foundation from all those church days and Sunday school. I had a lived experience of working in community and trying to serve both as a church and serve the church. But a lot of Richard Rohr, who you recently had on, he has this amazing book called The Immortal Diamond, which I read about 2 or 3 experiences in, that talks about the true self and the false self and the energetics of Christianity, and gave me a language to understand, oh yes, this is part of this tradition. I just hadn't tapped in, and I didn't have the lived experience of it yet. It's really opened up for me the ability that that there could be more dimensions to the Christianity, and really brought me into understanding my faith through my body. Theologically, we have an incarnational, we have an embodied path, but I hadn't experienced that until I began engaging with the psychedelic world and understand, and sort of brought everything sort of alive and thing lined up in a really unique way for me.
I see you, Hunt.
I just think I want to just real quickly piggyback on what Jessica said about the incarnational theology and this embodiment. Christianity at its core is God living in a human body. That's basic Christian theology. And yet over time, Christianity, the only part of the body that we really engage is the brain, and only a small part of that. So that, I think one of the things Jessica and I share is this return to our bodies through the opening that's like whatever psychedelics does in the brain opened us up to our bodies and opened us up to the presence of the Holy Spirit and God moving in our bodies. That is, and I think most of us are so disassociated from our bodies for various reasons. That's been part of the problem with Christianity, is it's this distrust of the body that some of Paul, not all, that gets sown in Paul a little bit, and then it just became all about sin, and it just misses the point. It misses the point of what Jesus was trying to do in the incarnation and the suffering and the resurrection. It's about the body.
Yeah. And I think for me, it was often like the body ended up being like the body of Christ, and that word ended up thinking to me became the institution. So it wasn't me, body, like in that context, body became the institution, or body became flesh, which wasn't necessarily the best context for it. And so a lot of when I was first, 2 years into this work, I was thinking, what are the 3 areas that have changed in my life as a cause of this, as the result of this work? And I was like, my flesh, faith, and freedom. I was like, the 3 F's: my body, my understanding of what the flesh was, the understanding of what my faith was, the understanding what real freedom was for myself. Like that was the beginning, and so, yeah, this idea of like, I love that. I think now I say I have a fleshy faith, I have a fleshy, that's lived body experience. And I think that it's important to have that vitality for me, my soul, my expression of the type of devotional heart that my soul longs to express needed that. And I didn't know it. I didn't know that. I was really happy with my faith. I was really happy psychologically. I wasn't, I had a contraction that like this job is sort of doing something to me, but it was sort of a healthy, balanced way of reflecting, is this job the right fit for me? But I was like, there was a whole other dimension, a whole other level that was ushered in when I sort of said yes. And saying yes I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I discerned for a while. I took 3 months. I was involved in prayer and meditation about it. And in my own faith language, I remember when I was about to, I received I was in a capsule, and when I received the capsule to take, I had it in my hand, and I looked down and I said, to me, in my language, it's God. I said, God, there's nowhere that I can go as a result of ingesting this that you will not be there. We have lots of examples in scripture. It's like, I can be at the bottom of the pits. I can be here and you can find me, right? David, all of these sort of things. And then it was like, I was like, all right, if all those things are true, now's the time to believe it. Yes, there's nowhere that I can go right now that you're not going to be. That gave me the ability to soften and surrender, right? And so that's where this idea of where does Christianity and psychedelic spiritual development or plant medicine practices come together. It's that flow between. It's actually the moment where you can apply what you believe and see, and it allows you to surrender, right? For my Pentecostal experiences, I do have it, and was baptized in the Holy Spirit and did develop a prayer language, right? So I know how to sort of release, to feel something else present and allow it to come through. Right. So when I had that first experience, it was not a strange realm to me. It was not somewhere that I was like, I don't know what's going on. And I didn't have a fear triggered. I was like, I know this place. This is actually a place that when I'm in church and at my most filled and I feel the presence of God, this is actually where my soul goes. There was a familiarity. And I think that surprised me. I didn't have particular thoughts about it, but when I reflected on it, I was like, I didn't really expect that, that how somehow my church trained me for my psychedelic experiences. What a contrast, just like we're talking about Hunt, I didn't see that. Getting to learn to pray in the Spirit is great practice to learn how to navigate a psychedelic journey.
Yep.
Who knew?
I have 30 different ways we can go right now. And all of them seem exciting to me. But one of the things that comes to mind when I talk to folks about this, and thank you both for being here and opening this conversation up, I, Jessica, I want to just hold these three ideas real quick because I want to return to them and I want to say them right now. Embodied leadership, divine feminine, and sacred plant medicine. I want to return to that because I want to. You obviously have a lot of flexibility with how you can navigate that territory, and so I want to get into that. Yeah. But the thing that occurs to me before we do that is that there's always some problem. I mean, there's something. Every time I talk to folks about psychedelics or healing, they're going to position this argument that says, "Well, we've lost something." And Hunt, you've talked about this, Jessica, you've mentioned this, that the body is not really present in Christianity. And so, what are your thoughts around what this movement, we can say, or what this recollection of these earlier practices from antiquity, certainly, that are bursting forth in our modern container? What do you think these are addressing in our psyches, in our collective?
For me, I think it's this ability to express yourself. I think, as I shared, this ability to understand the body is an ability to for me, it was beginning a radical path of self-love that I didn't have a way of understanding that before. I think what's really came alive for me in understanding the embodiment was that I was feeling it. I wasn't thinking it. There's this ability of being beyond words, and someone who has spent a lot of time studying, a lot of time convincing people, a lot of time designing interventions in society to make good. It got me out of my mind in the way that I was able to come in and really hear my own heart, really hear my own direction. What was also very powerful to me is that it opened up abilities and a knowing that was beyond my education, beyond my faith indoctrination or my faith teaching, right? All of a sudden I had a deeper knowing of things. And particularly as I shared as a Latina woman, all of a sudden I had this moment of understanding what it meant to decolonize Christianity. I had never had that moment appear in my life before. And Hunt, I'll tell a little bit of our story because I think it's a really beautiful one. Hunt and I were working together, and he asked me if I wanted to host a forum talking about these topics in Spanish. And I was like, so I thought about it, and it was sort of like, let me get back to you. And I wrestled with it. And I realized that I wanted to say no. Now, before I would have probably stressed myself out and been like, I'll prepare and I'll make it happen. And I was really busy. I thought, no, my body was saying something, right? So that's a new thing. My body was a no, and I was listening to it, right? So that's part of the trust that you build in these psychedelic spaces. So you have to learn to trust the body and the spirit and how it's communicating to you. So my body now trusts me that if it says no, I'm going to listen, versus I would kind of override it in the past a bit more, to be honest. And I was like, why does this feel like a no to me? And I realized that particularly when I'm talking about these topics, the plant and Christianity, I'm not necessarily talking just for my brainy part. It's not the academic me that's showing up. I am trying to stay in my heart, focused to the frequency of what I think both spirit and the medicine wants to communicate. How does it want to be? Mm-hmm. How does spirit and these medicines want to be represented? How can I be that servant advocate for them in service? And I realized that I could not do that in Spanish as easily. And I didn't know that until I was asked, because I grew up in Lancaster County in a white church. And I realized for the first time that God was English in my head. And I just never thought about it, because I can speak Spanish and I can think in Spanish and I can hear it, but I don't switch between English Spanish that often. But I hadn't ever had a moment where I had to think about God. And I was like, oh, I don't know that I could speak about God in the way that I want in Spanish. And it was this moment where I was able to say, Hunt, thanks for this invitation. It's opened up something for me. And I spent several months going into ceremonies, looking at what does it now mean to decolonize Christianity for me, and that my it seemed like my heart language was English when it came to the divine. That was a surprise to me. And so I did a series of ceremonies, in which it came through. And at one point, I was in a ceremony, and I had both a rosary, which is a much longer story, but is a sort of an edgy thing for me as a Protestant to own. But I was trying to practice rewilding that, and sort of maybe some of my ancestors had participated. And so I was trying to do some ancestral work. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll connect with it. I'd been doing it for about 6 months, and it wasn't really sticking. I was like, okay, well, I'll keep trying. Maybe it'll open up. Lots of years of patterning of not having a relationship. It's going to take more than a week till it means something. But I took it into the ceremony with me, and I have a little rattle that's like an egg, and I had them both. I don't remember in the ceremony when I picked them up. But there was this moment, and I was sitting, and it was like this prompt of the spirit said, look down. And I looked down, and in my left hand, I had the rosary, and it was wrapped around my left hand. And my right hand, I had the rattle. And I could all of a sudden look down, and I could feel energy circling between the left and right hand and going through my body. And it was a first moment that I realized the reason I wasn't connecting as much to the rosary is that deep subconsciously, I didn't know that was still a symbol of colonization to me. And I didn't know that until I was in that moment, right? And so I think that what had happened in that moment is to understand, okay, I could look at that from a psychological point of view or academic point of view. Okay, now how do I go about decolonizing it? But what happened to me in that ceremony was beyond that level. In that feeling of the energy connecting, I knew from that experience that you want to call it my genetic soul line, always had access to the divine. Always, whether I'm choosing to express it through Christianity, and my ancestors may have expressed it through ingesting some of these same plants, I have always, and my family line has always had access to the divine. And I believe that's true for everyone, but I can only speak to my own experience, right? And so that fundamentally began a radical decolonizing of Christianity, far more than all the books I read on it beforehand. It took it from the academic, experience into my body somehow is not feeling this as attention. And yet there's something there to explore. And understanding, where do I find the power to understand what that is? Fast forward 8 months from that moment, I was at a retreat, and we were doing a cacao, so non-psychedelic. It was, a special chocolate. It's tied to the ancestor and my personal ancestry. And the facilitator asked me to do a blessing over the cacao. We were going to ingest it and do some breath work. And I said, thank you. And it came up, and I was over the stove, and the smell of the chocolate. And I looked at the people, and I was the only person who was Spanish speaking there. And, it's like, I just got into that moment, right? Into the body, into the moment, opened my heart spirit. And I started praying, and out comes the prayer in Spanish. I prayed for 3-4 minutes. I was out of the way. Out of the way. It showed me that it was like, I can hold the frequency of understanding God. I have the linguistic skills. My heart and my spirit have the pathway and know it. All I have to do is get into the body and not let that fear get in the way. I was able to express it. And it was a revolutionary experience for me, right? I feel like, oh my goodness, I was able to do that. And what a healing that was, a healing that I didn't know I needed. Right. And so for me, a lot of this work is healing on things that you won't necessarily know to bring up in a therapy session. You won't necessarily know to say, I'm going to sign up for a retreat to work on that. But if, from my perspective, you trust the spirit and you trust the medicine, the plants, good facilitators, good containers are key to this. And if that you have that safety, then there's an ability to explore deeper areas. That is like, to me, this is like the deepest part of healings that then really open up your freedom in another way. If I wanted to say, I'm going to read all the books, and I'm going to take all the classes and all the, things to be able to preach in Spanish, I'd probably have a great go at it. That's a good endeavor. But for me, having that lived experience and that putting myself in that moment was a healing. That's sort of James Finley, who's also associated with the Center for Action and Contemplation, who's amazing. He said the mystic puts themselves in the position to have an experience with God, right? And so I think that that's a lot about when we come into these ceremonial spaces, whether it's with water, roses, cacao, psilocybin, whatever it is, it's that putting ourselves in the position for something to happen. And that's technically what we're supposed to be doing on Sunday morning when we go to church. What I love to do in sharing this is sharing the opportunity of, we get to have these personal experiences. We get to sort of take all the things that we've been exposed to, we get to mix them up in ourselves and come out a new creation. We get to have this new birth for ourselves. And so what I have really would love to sort of pivot over to Hunt and talk about, I've been saying, I had these experiences in a church. And what does that sort of mean about the power of what it is in the work that we're doing, particularly at Ligare, of sort of saying, okay, I'm not the only one. I think someone asked me once, is like, what is a psychedelic Christian? Can you put those two things together? And I was like, I think so. I was like, yeah, actually, we already exist, because like, I'm already here. Like, like, it's not like we're waiting. Can we invent this thing? It's happened. Is it true? Someone says, is it truth? It's like, yeah, I can say it's true because I'm true, my expression of it. Now, how we extrapolate that across all institutions and people, that's what we're trying to do with Ligare. But there's, for me, I like to stand for the fact that we can claim, I feel comfortable claiming that I am a Christian, a psychedelic Christian, because I am those things, and I get to say who I am and determine what that means. Now we get to decide there's more than one of us. There's a few of us. There's, and there's clergy. we're even more lucky we got some clergy on our, and so then, how we found each other. And that's what was really exciting. I was doing this work for about 4 years before I got to meet Hunt. And then we were connected through a mutual friend. And I aligned to say yes and support his amazing vision of what it would be like if it's not just me over here, as amazing and important it is for every individual to experience their fullest liberation. What would it be like if there were more of us? We joined that power together, and we could accompany each other, and we could both integrate together and dream together. And if there were enough of us, could we really influence the church? Could we influence the church? Could we improve it? Could we expand it? Could we soften? Could we help it heal? And so all of those questions were burning and bubbling up in my soul. And Spirit Divine and a really good friend combined, where I got to meet the Reverend Hunt Priest. And it was like, something, in my language, the divine is up to something when multiple things are popping up, right? Because when something wants to birth itself, it doesn't come to one person. It comes to multiple people. And it's about each person. I'm living my vision and my lived expression from my own life of what it means to be a psychedelic Christian. Hunt's going to live his, other people living theirs, and all of us together is what births a new thing. And so Ligare and the work that Hunt and the vision and the boldness Hunt had to say, I'm going to step away from a formal parish to take care of, to pull together a group of people who are moving around the globe, and say, what would it be like if we come together and try to make a change? And so I'm going to pass it off to Hunt to share his amazing vision that I have decided to be like, I'm all in for it. But I met Hunt, I was like, whatever you need, I'm in. And so Hunt, share your vision with all of us.
Oh, well, and this just came up yesterday. So this is, the vision is to really connect these individuals and communities to each other and to the church and to God, as revealed in Jesus for Christians. And there's Jewish organizations, there's small Muslim organizations, but Buddhist. But this is the Christian conversation, not the exclusion of others, but in the Christian conversation. And just yesterday, this group in California, close to Sacramento, I think, that's kind of a suburb of Sacramento, have been meeting. They were doing psychedelic work individually, and they were in a group. And all of a sudden, one of them said, this may not be what everybody wants to hear, but I'm actually a Christian. And then somebody else said, so am I. So they've been meeting as a group of about 8 or 9 people doing psychedelic work together from their Christian perspective and their Christian background, various manifestations of that. And they've been doing that, and they saw me or heard me on a podcast. So then they're like, oh, wow, there's others. And so I had this fantastic conversation with them yesterday. And it's just emerging. It's like emerging like mushroom emerge, or like the early church, which was a network of loosely connected communities. They were all trying to figure it out in their own places. So wherever they were in the Greek world or in the
Mm-hmm.
ancient Near East. They were trying to figure it out. So that's the model, I think, for this is both the mycelial network that mushrooms have
Mm.
to connect with each other and to feed each other and take care of each other, and the early church, which was a loose configuration of communities connected to each other, but feeling called by the risen Christ to be themselves in the world. So the vision is, I think, just what I just said, loosely connected communities of people, because Christianity is diverse, and we know that sort of intellectually. But as a friend of mine on the board, my friend Tim Tutt says, there's multiple Christianities.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Jessica's experience of psychedelics through is going to be filtered and seen through her lens of Baptist, Pentecostal, evangelicalism, and her social justice work. Mine's going to be seen through my Episcopal formation and my priestly ministry and me and my own experiences. And that's all beautiful because we have this diverse experience of God in Christ. And so there's not going to be one way to do Christian psychedelics because there's no one way to do Christianity. We need to respect each other, our different paths. Pentecostalism, I think if we could really embrace the teachings of Pentecostalism and the early Pentecostal movement in the early church, certainly the first Pentecost, but then the Azusa Street movement in the U.S. that was an inbreaking of the Holy Spirit, that was led by women, and it was a people of color. There was all of the vision of the early church came to manifest in that movement, and then it hit American culture, which is kind of male dominated and white dominated, and this we have to be right and you have to be wrong. That's what happens in these movements. So for the Christian psychedelic movement to embrace all of it and say there's not one way to do this. Let's learn from each other. Let's be safe. Let's keep God and Christ at the center of this, and let it come up through us. That's the vision. I don't know. We're sort of in a way making it up as we go, and that we don't really know where this is headed. But we know it's if we're together and we keep risen Christ at the focal point and trust each other and trust God, I think the sky's the limit. So,
Mm-hmm.
Why psychedelics? Why? Like, what's the nature of psychedelics that's so unique? Why not breathing in a cave or sex magic or something?
Well, all of it. But I think psychedelics is, I think I've heard Bill Richards say this at Hopkins, is it's reliable, it's safe, and it gets you there. And I didn't have time. I frankly didn't have time to go spend 40 days on a meditation retreat. I think I could have gotten there. Lots of people in monastic communities are having these experiences. Some are, and without psychedelics, because they've got this taste and time and predilection to do that. I don't, and I do. My meditation and prayer practice is so much deeper now than it was before psychedelics. So I came back to the things I've been trying to work on without them, and have deepened. I'm totally different Christian than I was. I'm a different priest because now I actually honestly believe in my body what I've been saying out of my head and through my mouth about the power of healing, about the power of laying hands, about the power of meditation and prayer. I talked about it and did it sometimes by rote, and now I really understand that in that there's a transfer of energy that happens between me and the person on whose head I lay my hands. Something's happening.
Well, this thought comes to mind about something maybe you and I talked about, Hunt, but that if somebody is going to lead communities of people in a religious context, they need to have had a religious experience. And how often the leaders don't. I mean, I've said this story before, and I want to plant this seed here. There was a time where a friend died, and I went to the church. It was a Bible-oriented church, and the minister was saying, first of all, it was a suicide. And so there were complexities about how the Christian church makes sense of suicide. And this church was notably very fundamentalist. And what the preacher said was, never go within, always go to the book, and spoke of heaven as this like music-filled streets of gold and all these images. And it's such a problematic worldview that where it's essentially creating a dependency on the institution itself, unaware of the fact that it's a manipulative approach. And I don't want to speak so back to this question that I was asking about what the problem is. It sounds like both of you are, and I'm totally in alignment here, are saying that the unique lived experience of an individual is positioned as some kind of godliness as opposed to a dependency on an institutionalized form.
For sure.
Fair to say.
Yes. So
Sure.
why would the experience of the disciples or of Paul or the the early church, why would their experience, they had experiences, whatever they were. We value those so much that we put them in the book. Paul's no different from me. The disciples are no different from Jessica. Our experiences are as valid as theirs. And we have the benefit of knowing more about the nature of the human person, the nature of the cosmos, and we have scientific knowledge that really can come to bear on something like suicide.
Mm-hmm.
That suicide is depression. That it's not a sin; it's a medical condition.
Mm-hmm.
The person is affected by it. That had nothing to do with anything the person did or didn't do. It's and so that and the church has generally changed its theology of suicide. So when you hear that, it just makes God, the damage that's done to that family and the people that come to that, the people that are dealing with depression, are then told not to go in, which is where we really have to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jesus, who went in by getting away from all those people that wouldn't leave him alone, he went to the wilderness, went to a quiet place to pray, to go in, be with God.
Mm-hmm.
Kingdom of God is, So that makes me so mad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so damaging.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that is also this idea of, where you're just saying where the authority is, and it's nervous for a clergy person to be like, which is part of the work that we're doing with Ligare, is trying to explain these to clergy. Hunt's, part of his service in this is explaining it to clergy so that they can understand when someone comes to them and says, I've had this experience. It's hard for them if they haven't had the experience to give them right counsel. Right. I know that I've found it personally, really, I relaxed a lot when I got into a relationship and knowing Hunt, because I kind of was like, I could bring up something. I'm like, I think it might be kind of on the edge. For me, it was an edge on where's shamanism? Where's Christianity? Where's the line? I'm working my way through. It's kind of nice to have some other people, because I do want some sort of healthy spiritual accountability. I don't need him to be like, slam me down and give me a rule. But can I talk about this? Can I say that there's an edge? Where are you? How are you working the edge? How have you come to understand that? So a lot of the work that we're doing in Ligare is to opening up these questions of having people, I was recently in a circle, I was helping, I had over 6 people in a circle, 12 people come to me and they were like, this work, psychedelics, it's really powerful. I'm doing deep healing. And, but I don't know how to tell my Christian aunt or my Christian uncle or my mom. And people were like, they're afraid to talk to the Christian in their life. And that is like, we sort of chuckle, and yet that breaks my heart. I was like, what has happened? That as Christians, we should be the people you want to talk to. We should be the most open-hearted and listening. We are commanded to love one another. There's nothing else we should be doing here except that, and figuring out how to express that love in ways that stand on the side of the oppressed and bring liberation for those who need it. I don't know what you're doing if you're not doing that. We're working our way to understanding that and making it more complex, but it is that simple. And so people have that both. They don't know to talk. People don't know how to talk to other Christians in their life. People don't know how to talk to their clergy members. I had to figure out, I negotiated where my spiritual boundaries were with my facilitators, because I also was in containers that were not Christian. I was the only Christian. They were probably anti-Christian, to be honest. A lot of people have a lot of hurt. A lot of people who are in this work are actually in the work because they're relieving organized religion. And so I had to be like, hey, this is where you can work with me. These are the things. I had this big negotiation with a facilitator who I trusted deeply, who said, well, maybe you should, set an intention to, understand your divinity or understand that you were God. And I was like, oh, I am not God. Theologically, I am not God, and I will never be God. That is a hard no for me. And we had to negotiate that, because that's where I am. I said, however, I was able to work and talk about my boundaries with that. And I said, but I was able to set an intention of to allow myself to get a deeper awareness of the divinity through me, through that is given to me by through Christ, and that's as a Christian, right? And I had an expansive experience. Story for another time. I experienced true incarnation, and I got to experience resurrection. It was beyond potent in one night, but so I had to learn to negotiate that. I didn't have anyone to talk to about like, hey, how do I figure out to tell a facilitator where my spiritual boundaries are? I didn't have a priest or pastor to be like, how do I understand shamanism in the way? And how do I understand that is actually part of my own spiritual heritage? That's something I'm working on, talk about decolonizing Christianity, that the spiritual expressions that we have through our ancestry, are much more shamanistic. And we carry that, and we carry abilities and talents in that. What does that mean? How do I reconcile that? Do I need to reconcile that? How do I accept that? All of these things are places, these are the type of conversations we're trying to seed and create space for some resources where people can say, are you considering having an experience like this? Here are things to talk about. How do you talk about your Christianity? How do you talk about what your borders are? People have very little experience about how to share their faith. I'll be honest, I do this professionally. We are not good, particularly in America and particularly as Christians, in having conversations about our faith. We aren't given that. Some evangelicals do apologetics, but it's a very confrontational. It's like, let me prove you wrong. It's not story sharing. I told someone at that meeting, I said, you do not have to preach psychedelics, but you can learn to tell a story that advocates for your healing. If you're trying to connect with someone, you don't have to convince them about the psychedelic. You don't have to convince them about your breath work. You don't have to convince them about your yoga. But you can learn to share a story where it advocates for your health. That's where you're going to connect. You're talking to someone who their Christianity is core to their identity, and that's how you view them. You think it's core to them, and you want to have this conversation with them. Talk about your healing, because we do in general. Even though you can get some pretty strict people out there, but healing will soften most people's hearts. We're all trying to get it in some form. And so part of the work that I do is helping people understand, how do we have conversations about our faith? This is not a natural thing for me, that I did not grow up thinking I'd want to do this, being on a podcast. I'll tell you, I had this moment 4 years ago where I was doing some archetypal work. Union. Father Richard Rohr I was reading a lot of his work. As I said, I was in a container, we were traveling, and we were setting intention. And it's think of someone that you admire deeply. And so Father Richard Rohr came up to my mind really quickly. Like, first thing. So you go with the first thing. And it's like, what do you think that person has that you don't? And I was like, ooh, that's a question, right? So I sat with that. I was working with a partner. And for Richard Rohr, it was me. For me, that moment, it was like he had took a singular vow because of his vocation, and he's organized his life around that. And that's what I felt he had that I didn't have, right? Because I'm trying to build a justice movement, pay my rent, pay off my student debt, be happy, take care of my family. I feel in my head at the time, I thought he has the ability to live his singular vow, and I do not, because of my life context, right? So that was the duality I was in. So then process goes on. All right. So sit with that. And it was the vow that got me. He had a vow and an ability to build a life around the vow. So going into the archetypal work, I was then invited by Spirit to say, why don't you work at embracing the bride archetype for this, ceremony that I was going in? Not my natural inclination. I'm not very bridey. I'm not actually married. I don't have anything against brides, but brides are not where I go. Right? It wouldn't be like, yes. I was like, oh, bride. Okay. So I was like, but where your stretch is where you're supposed to go. Right. Yeah. So I'm good for following a process. Make long story short, I go through it. I travel across the world. I'm in another place. And I need to claim that I'm going to embody the archetype of the bride. And I get up to say it, and I say priestess. I don't say bride. Everybody in the room knows I'm the bride. And I say priestess. And they're just like, great. Move on. And then we were walking up to a sort of a sacred well in the country we were in. And I'm walking up, and I'm getting rustling in the spirit. I was like, why did I do that? like my heart is not okay. I know that I have violated something. I knew I was coming as the bride, prepped as the bride, and I said this thing. I was like, what was that? And the group kind of went ahead, and a light mist starts falling, it's all very dramatic, climbing up a hill. And I asked, God, I said, why is the bride? Why do you want the bride? I don't understand this. And well, basically experiencing why the priestess. And I was like, I don't want to be the bride. It was like, and the divine said, I don't need any more teachers. I don't need any more teachers. It's like, but what I do need are people that the word was fleshy, which is why I use fleshy. I need fleshy love. That's what I need. It's like, what is it about the bride? The bride is not embarrassed to show her love in public. I came undone, heart open, sobbing the whole way up to the holy, I was going to a sacred well. I got there and I said, yes, I took vows. I told God, I say yes. I say I do. I say I'm here. Right? Then I was sitting on this hill, very nice countryside, and literally a flock of sheep kind of come and walk by me, start to surround me. So I'm processing this really big moment. And I hear again the prompting of the Spirit. Remembering in Peter, it said, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. And that is the story that I went back to when Hunt asked me to join Ligare. I thought, do I really believe in the institutional church? Am I really going to use my energy to sort of save and try to transform it? And that moment, feed my sheep, which in scripture was like, serve my people, right? And so all of working that archetype came into being able to be here talking about, I say, I love the divine and I love this work. And it's a passion of mine to do. That is as a result of this work. That is a result of this work. If you met me 10 years ago, it would have not been that, because I'm able to hold who I am and express who I am because I felt that in my body and I was invited into that process. And I think that kind of goes to where we were going in the question of, why psychedelics? And the other thing we often hear is, well, isn't this a shortcut? Isn't this a shortcut, to your mystical experience? And there's different reactions to it. When someone says, isn't this a shortcut to me? I want to see, why are they asking that question? Are they interested in mystical development? Are they trying to understand my process? And for someone like that, I usually talk and share that we all come into life and into this work with very different experiences. We have different bodies. We have different pressures. We have different contexts in which we live in. We have different pressures on our nervous systems. We have different relationships to power and our proximity to power. We have different experiences about our the impact of white body supremacy on ourselves. I'm a Latina. I've experienced it in some way, but I also have not. My proximity to whiteness limits me and my Black sisters and brothers and siblings have different experiences. All of these things that we were coming into, how do we arrive to a ceremony? And what was really life-changing to me about working with the sacred plant medicines is it allowed me to get out of the mind, but allowed me to get into the body and allowed my nervous system to relax and surrender. I wouldn't have gotten into the mystical experience had I not been able to come into myself, had I not been able to realize that I am abundance, and to find that that is good, to find that I am good. Resma Menakem, if you do work with him, he will constantly say, you are not defective. And when you're in a group of people, I've studied with him of bodies of culture, which is what he calls, people who are non-white, bodies of culture, to not focus the whiteness, bodies of culture. And he says, you are not defective. You will see people will start to cry. Will cry because there is a pressure of perfectionism, of trying to fit in. For me, powerful assimilation, trying to be the perfect, trying to be the great Latina, trying to be the best in school. All of that comes in when you rock up to the ceremony. You're bringing all of that, even if you're not conscious. And so having the psychedelics drop me into the body and beginning to experience the fullness and the possibility and deep levels of healing the body, then open the door for me to have a deeper mystical experience. So I don't find that that's a shortcut. I find that the body work is almost the prerequisite. It's the way of being able to come in a way that I would have to process a whole lot in years of therapy to be able to get ready to do all of that and might not ever have the languaging to express it, that psychedelics opens the door and eases that process in. So that's kind of one answer. And then the other answer, depending on if the person's like comes from it's a shortcut and they kind of want me to earn, and they kind of want me to be like, you can't get there before me. It's not in a generous sort of aspect. I often say to them, maybe some of us are due a shortcut. Maybe some of us are due that shortcut. And can we take this idea of a shortcut and flip that into a conversation that some of us are due a shortcut, and maybe this is the beginning of actually having a justice conversation. Maybe this is the beginning of actually having a reparations conversation. Is this the beginning of having an equity conversation? So no matter what we're talking about, particularly in the Christian church context, I like to say that this is this opportunity to open, saying, where are we going to land on psychedelics? To me, it's either here nor there. I'm going to do what I'm going to do anyway. It is more about what are we going to reflect, and how is this going to improve or open or add liberation to those of us who are in the church, right? So to me, it's a perfect opener to get through, because wanting to earn and being sort of feeling a way about someone getting a shortcut is really rooted in white supremacy. It's really rooted in overwork. It's rooted in, and for me and others, it's rooted in like, actually a lot of these technologies and they were part of our history. You actually came to our shores and killed us because we understood the divine this way. And so guess what? It's not a shortcut. It was actually mine to begin with. You're actually taking the shortcut, And so like there is the coming back of like what that really means, and how do we do that in a loving and challenging way. But for me, that's another thing. As much as I love the experience and the spiritual development thing that happens with psychedelics, I'm here at Ligare and working alongside Hunt because I think it's a perfect opportunity to have these conversations. We don't often. I do a lot of work for social justice of trying to get people to vote, trying to combat bad immigration, policies. And those appeal to certain types of people. You get a different type of person and different types of feeling when they want to talk around psychedelics. So I love that we're having a conversation about something that people have questions for. I love that you're like, is that a shortcut? Let me explain how not necessarily a shortcut, or maybe I'm due for a shortcut, but let's have the conversation. Let's get beyond the thing. Let's talk about healing, regardless of the modality. We all have big theologies of healing. Let's talk about healing. I experienced a really big divine healing, and it became the biggest secret in my life. Biggest secret. I had a pretty serious medical diagnosis, and no one ever knew. No one ever knew, because I felt uncomfortable that I got the miracle healing, and someone beside me with the same diagnosis was not getting that. And I was like, and I had no way of explaining the difference of my experience to their experience. Part of the work I did in psychedelics helped me loosen that and realize I don't have to explain the mystery. It's not up to me. And that's the same with the psychedelics. I don't actually have to explain the mystery of it all. We can just partake of it and recognize that it is a kind mystery. Christianity in and of itself is a mystery. So we have to be able to get comfortable with the mystery and talk about those mysteries. Why is it that, what are we talking about healing? Why is some people get some form of it and others? And then what's the psychedelic approach to that? That I think is the most healthy way to start having these conversations versus having them in a vacuum. Let's not make a decision about psychedelics and then about real healing and then about let's not label it. Let's not go into the duality. Let's go into the complexity. And we have the tools, the institution, and we have people who can guide us through these conversations.
Well, what'd you hear in that, Hunt?
Gospel. I heard truth.
Yeah.
I heard hard truth.
Yeah.
And that all of it, but that part about this was our medicine to begin with. This was our sight. Yeah. This is our access to God to begin with. And I think there's in indigenous communities, my sense of it, and some limited exposure, but people I've known, is there's a generosity.
Yes.
I think a lot of people in South America and in the US with other Maria Sabina in Mexico wanted this to be available. So, and another way I've heard that aren't some of us who do a shortcut isn't life hard enough, right? It's for many, 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 and coming out of the quarantines and the fractured politics and the climate crisis. Life is hard, and damn it, life is hard. And so, okay, I don't think it's a shortcut because I think it's hard work. Psychedelics are hard work.
It's not easy.
It's not easy because hard stuff comes up, and your body. I mean, it's just hard. But God Almighty, it's hard to. It's right now. It's hard to be alive, and so to be able to do it, to be able to have some insights into God, into ourselves, into the nature of life is a gift. And I don't see the indigenous communities putting a fence around it like Europeans, like people that look like me.
Yeah, and I think the fact is that it's also, so there's like the quick and pithy shortcut conversation, and then there's this idea of containers and what reciprocity looks like. What does justice look like? What does eco justice look like? A lot of these substances are coming from the earth, and we're not taking great care of the earth. What does indigenous reparations and reciprocity look like? What does the container? But so it's like how can we start with the shortcut conversation? How can we expand it, and how can we expand it even further to make sure that we're encompassing all of the best lived values that we want to have, right? How do we prioritize who has access to medicine? Let's not have the access conversation replicate the dominance towards the privileged. I will admit I'm able to do this work because I'm able to travel, and I have access. I've been able to get funds to be able to go and do that. And it's not been an easy, or it has not been an inexpensive adventure. And so how do we make it, democratize it? How do we, bring the best of the church? Has buildings, people, land, resource. Like it's not like we can't figure out how to find a place in most places in the United States where a circle could begin. We got churches. I work with clergy around voting, and I was like, we actually got clergy in most places where people are voting. We have a base, and we have resources. And so how can opening the doors of those resources actually be a way of decentering whiteness, of realigning the values that we really want to have, and showing up in solidarity with ourselves, even beyond just sort of the quintessential racial dynamics, but showing up for each other as people. Showing up. We have been, as Hunt was saying, we've been separated through both the pandemic and everything that's happened. And so I think that the ability that the church has is that it does have a model of a small that's able to come around. It has a local context. When we do have mega churches and some of those, and they're kind of a different model, but there is a local context. And so I think you can enter into this work, whether you are a person of color or not, with a deep respect for the locality of where you are, what's local to the place where you are, and the medicines and the plants and the fungi and the mushrooms that you're working with. Get to know a little more about them. Resource it properly. There's so many opportunities, just like there's so many opportunities to make a small step to help climate change. There's so many opportunities to make a small step, which we'll call psychedelic justice. So let's make sure that we don't keep this as just a spiritual conversation. We can actually we can live out our spiritual values by making this a justice conversation in which we can all participate in these circles and build justice. We can make a decision about where we rent to go. We can make a decision about who we buy our chocolate from. We can make a decision, like all of these opportunities are to live, all of that. And so I think that we can make it more complex, and that complexity actually makes it easier for us to make small steps towards yes, more small steps of like, hey, I'm being intentional. Might not be perfect, but I know I'm being intentional here, and I'm seeking to learn more. That open heart, that teachable heart. And that's why so many of the indigenous communities are so welcoming, because they have that openness of heart, and let us meet them with that level of intentionality.
Definitely. Right.
There's a thought that I was having about this tension between the personal and the private dimensions of these experiences, and then the need to bring those into community, and how
Absolutely.
I think about that image of Moses, on the mountaintop, whatever in the hell Moses was doing up on that mountaintop, I'm not quite sure, but it seems appropriate for this conversation. And then he comes down and says, oh, hey, by the way, folks, I know how we can all live together. Let's have one voice. Let's have, don't fuck each other. Don't kill each other. Don't steal from each other. Don't, let's get clear here. But so we have these, it seems to me that we have these opportunities for the inner journey and to go inward in a community. But there are, to your point, Hunt, about these mycelial networks, as soon as the communities get large enough, they start to fragment and some other objective comes online. So I'd love to hear you both talk about this, the idea of balancing these intensified personal and private experiences of divinity and the need for us to bring those personal and private experiences into a community. So just launch that.
Let me, as somebody who's been leading congregations for 16 or 17 years, one of the frustrations I've had is that so often we don't bring our true, honest selves into, whether it's Sunday morning, everyone says everything's fine. And I knew damn well that they
right.
And they weren't often for me. There were things that were, my wife was sick for a long time. And I would just say, oh, yeah, everything's great. And so there's something about that can happen in small groups that can't happen in a big group, which is you really can develop a level of trust where you can really be honest and say, you know what, it's really terrible. And I could use your prayers, or I could use a casserole, or I could use you to just know what's going on. So getting honest, getting real, and the church at its best does that. We really do that. And we have the potential to do it better. So, and if church is not about a place where you can share your own experiences of God, sadly, we've made it about the priest or the preacher, and his or her experience of God is really the one that matters. And that's, as much as I'd love to push back on that and try to from time to time, it's like we've trained people so much to say, well, your experience is secondary because I've got the education or I've got the position. And I think the more we can flatten all of that out, the model of church, our architecture kills us because we put the preacher up high, the altar up high, and it makes people forget that we're all in this together. So if we could actually, I think that gather around the altar in a Catholic church or an Episcopal church where there's a Eucharistic, any community that has a Eucharistic theology, actually stand together around the table instead of boxing it off like we do and say, it's only for the priest. So the more we can make this any spiritual community, psychedelics can help with this, a place of honesty, a place of storytelling that I can tell my experience that may be helpful for you because may connect with your own story. And then to do that in a local community and then let it be connected to other communities. And that's really how change happens. That's how healing at its best happens that way. It happens in community. The church for the last 300 years until recent time invested resources in hospitals and training doctors and nurses because we understood that healthy bodies and healthy souls and healthy emotions were all connected. And then because of scale, and we turned it over to a capitalist model to bring healing. And guess what? It doesn't. It brings more sickness. It brings more. We're less healthy than we were. So I'm not saying I don't want the church to run hospitals anymore, but I'm saying we have a role. We have an important role to play in healing, and we need to claim it. And if that's churches hosting eventually at our camp and conference centers retreats, which I would be if I got to be in charge of it, that's what we would do. And then people would bring that back to their local communities, and there'd be local circles of people sharing their circles, sharing that. And there's models for that. We have it. So.
I'm just so tickled by, tell me if this is what you're saying. What you're saying is that you wish small groups of churches would facilitate people taking things like psilocybin in community to convene with God and having a place to do the integration work.
Yeah.
It just, I have like a little boy inside of me that is so affected by this institution that, and a country, a country that has
Very much
been
so.
so hypocritical around its relationship to this. What Michael Winkelman says, that we are in a cult of alcohol.
Oh God.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my
That
God.
we demonstrate when he looks at the substance that a culture
Mm-hmm.
is invested in. So you would look down in Peru and you would say, okay, there's an ayahuasca dynamic, and here's how they facilitate, and here's how they connect, and here's a religious tradition. We, on the other hand, are an alcohol cult. And so how does that, what do we do for healing? What do we do for economics? What do we do for religion? What do we do? So to be this young boy who grew up with this odd hypocrisy and looking out and saying, God, they're saying don't do this stuff, and then not, and yet now to hear about religious traditions that are openly seeking to bring something like psilocybin and the like into their religious structure just makes me giggle. I just want to giggle.
Let me be clear. I'm not speaking for the Episcopal Church, even though I wish I could.
Those were my words. Yeah,
We're talking biggest vision,
Yeah.
highest vision. Yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking about where you are, John, in Houston, and I have a lot of Episcopal clergy friends there.
Yeah.
The Diocese of Texas, with all of its resources, has an incredible camp and conference center where I've been for lots of conferences.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things, those sort of places where we've already got, this. I'm not saying this is going to happen next year, but I'm saying we can finally do this legally and safely and have all what we need to do that. God, what a gift it would be for those places because we own them, and
The infrastructure. Yeah.
we got the infrastructure, and we've got people. I would love for people that have an experience like we've had, that say, I'm willing to donate. I want to offer 3 weeks a year to come staff, not as the professional, but as the cook or the person that sits with somebody and holds their hand and just creates the hospitality. And there's models. Cursillo and the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church are models for that, where people have an experience and then come back and give to that. So we've got it. We've just got to shift our thinking and let go of some really bad information we have about psychedelics. And we have to know that these are not for everyone, and we have to keep people safe. It's not like taking an aspirin for your headache to go away.
Right.
It opens up a lot, and we have to be prepared to deal with what comes.
Jessica, I saw you writing when we were, going through that. I'm wondering what stirred.
Yeah, he's on writing. What I was doing. All of that. Yes. And what we're trying to do is build, what are the structures? What are the containers? Or is there liturgy that's more conducive? Is there a structure? What is the integration? So there's the experimentation phase of where we're at, right? This is sort of a, and in the, arc of this, we're at the beginning, right? We're experimenting, we're figuring out, as a movement, we're trying to figure out, and that's why it's important that people can connect with each other, because people who are experimenting can share. I tried this, I didn't try that, this is what works. I'm always cautious, and maybe that I'm a little more sensitive, being female bodied. I was also like, gee, I don't want to join a cult here. Like, I was trying to figure out, so where, like, we need to use great discernment, which is why it's important to have a variety of perspectives, a variety of Christians, variety of professionals. We have a lot of safety training also within churches, because we have dealt with abuse in many of its forms. So we have to also be willing to talk the whole talk, right? And we have experiences in a lot of these areas. And so the question is, yes, I wholly want all of what Hun is saying, and we can say that because we know we're going to put the work in on creating the safety and structures that are needed for that. And the ability for people to, this is an opt-in. If all things about your spiritual life should be opt-in, it's invitation. And we want to increase access for people to be able to say yes and have a safe experience, and experience that aligns with where their spiritual sort of upbringing has been. Going back to the part of your original question, which is where I was writing, was, what does it mean for people to have these experiences and bring them back to community? Yeah. And that's part of where I've been sort of writing about, how does this impact our theology making? How does it impact the way that we understand and reinterpret scripture? And who gets to have the power to do that? At Ligare, we're incubating a theology sort of working group of people who are interested in thinking about revisiting or expanding theological in the academic sense, which is important. That's how you do some of the culture change. I've done a lot of culture change work, right? So we're trying to hit all the levers: institutional church, academia, lived experiences of people with multiple types of both social and economic and racial backgrounds. So it's a multi-layered movement, really, what you're trying to do. And for me, I think, just from my rabble rouser in the pew to Hunt's priest, I think that the question is, how are these experiences listened to? When I share that story, if I would go back 5 years and I was sharing it from the beginning, I didn't really need to have a conversation whether you agreed with the substance or not. But if I opened my heart and shared that with you, I just needed you to track with me. I just need you to witness me. I didn't need you to process it necessarily with me or tell me anything about it. So it's the training of people to understand, even in our spiritual spaces, to learn how to be good listeners, to learn how to be good witness. It's part of, I could definitely see, making that small group facilitators curriculum workbook about what would it be like if we actually do start these small groups? How would we train the lay people who are, running these circles of how to listen and witness, and how do we become better? And that'll apply long beyond the stories of what happened in a ceremony, right? Most of us just need to be witnessed in our lives and held. And seen, have the goodness seen in us. And so I think that there's something also in particular, I think, for people of color, and particularly for women who have spoken up in institutional Christian spaces, their thoughts have been dismissed for a long time historically. So I think in decentering patriarchy and decentering whiteness, it's really important. I think we need to overemphasize and over-listen and maybe over-curate the experiences of people of color and of women in these liminal realms, and to consider, with discernment, of course, but to consider what is happening there as the same as theological development, to give it the same, because historically we have been marginalized in saying, well, that's not real doctrine, that's not real, that's not real theology making. And so we're coming up, this is a chance to flip that script and say, we're not really sure where all this psychedelic thing is, but we're not going to do that pattern. We're going to listen, and we're going to be really intentional on the way that we listen, and that we will up our discernment, right? We're going to teach how to be discernment and not oppressive, right? That's hard. It's hard in a spiritual realm to learn when you're discerning something, or when you're using the pattern of a pattern thinking that can lead to oppression really easily, unconscious bias, as we'll call it, right? And so let's get into that type of process, and we should be more sophisticated about it. We have to up the game here if we're going to increase the amount of heart that's open. These substances open your heart, and they open up your spirit in a big way. So it requires all of us to open up our spirits and our hearts and our intentions towards that person in a big way. It's not just one person. It's the context in which we build for that person to have the experience. What would it be like for a small group to send off someone to a ceremony, and the backing that person would feel, knowing they have a home group to come home to, that they know they have people who are holding the frequency, holding the love. I had people who I knew were praying for me when I was in these moments. They knew I was going on a retreat, and I asked for that prayer. Those things are important, and that builds community regardless of whether someone is participating in ingesting a psychedelic or not. That's just good loving each other in my book.
Agreed. I want to be conscientious of our time, because we got about 10 to 12 minutes. There's a lot to circle up on. I mean, this is I'm curious. Jeff Kripal and I spoke, by the time this podcast will come out, my interview with Jeff Kripal will have come out. And we talked about decolonization, and you've used that term so much. So that's a good thread and a byline in our process. So I certainly want to tap on that a little bit, but I also want to just say, as we close, what little threads are hanging out that we need to revisit or bring into our conversation in order for this to feel complete. So Han, I see you nodding your head, and Jessica, you are too. Would you both just kind of think about, maybe you could take maybe 5 minutes apiece and reflect on this conversation and what you feel needs to be included as we close out. Whoever wants to go first, go for it.
I'll start. I may not need 5 minutes, but I think one thing that's really important is for Christians and psychedelic people as well who are not Christian or have animosity toward it. This exists in Christian space because this is spiritual work of healing and transformation, and that's the work of the church. That's a lot of the work of the church, is healing and transformation, both of individuals and of culture. And so the science shows us clearly that these substances used safely and cautiously, but safely, can bring about tremendous healing for addiction, depression, anxiety, trauma, fear of dying, things, all of those things the church cares about, Christians care about. And we know through science and research and testimony, not just the science, but through testimony of people, that these do bring that about. And it brings it about because people have an encounter with God or the mystery of the universe, whatever the language is, they have a mystical experience. And so again, if we don't care about healing as a church, we don't care about mystical experience, and we don't care about transformation, then what are we doing? So, and we've always been willing to embrace new technology. So 50 years of terrible information, politically motivated, racially motivated information has caused, even me, when I saw that ad, I was open, but I only was willing to do it because it was through an institution, a research institution that cared. I laugh about this, but I was shocked that these institutions cared what clergy thought, honestly. So the fact they cared and they wanted our input and it was seemed safe because it was in that setting, I was all in. Otherwise, I'd been so impacted by the propaganda of the war on drugs that it wasn't like I hadn't done drugs, but I hadn't done psychedelics because something about that seemed scary. And so, and here I am, a priest in the Episcopal Church in a collar, talking about this because it had such a dramatic impact on me. My wife had some dramatic healing from a serious illness. Friends, people I've gotten to know now through psychedelic conversations, committed Christians. This belongs in the church and elsewhere. And so I think that's the loose thread I want is there is 100%, it's 100% in the right place. And it should be in other places too, but this is a legitimate place for us to talk about it. Wow. And we have a lot to offer the movement. We have a lot to offer the movement as the church.
Yes. Yeah. We can show up as good neighbors, right? To everyone in the moment. I hear Hunt and I'm like, yes, right? It's like I'm re-enrolled. This is what I want. This is like, I think for me, particularly it's the question of, people, it's wrestle. It's like, is this correct? Is there a historical basis for this? Is it possible? It's like, to have psychedelic Christianity, it's sort of like that trying to get that yes, no, trying to say, is it right or wrong? That type of, those questions, they lead us down a certain type of path that's really going to most likely help us repeat patterns of oppression and silencing. And for me, I'm less interested whether there's a historical basis, although there are good arguments that there have been some, but I'm not living historically, I'm living now. There's less, I'm less personally interested in is it right or wrong, or I'm less personally compelled that I need a seal of approval from an external source. That's my independent sort of, I have a direct discerning with the divine that I get to express, and the autonomy, that's the freedom and the liberation. I was talking from the flesh, faith, freedom. That's the freedom. I have the freedom to explore that. But what I'm really interested in, and with the work of Ligare and this movement, it's the how. For me, this is a question of not if or did it. It's like how. It's here. So how does this work together? And I think that just opens us up to all the types of conversations that I like. For me, it's a lens. It's a bit of a spiritual lens that now I apply to how I see both my Christian path and how I see the possibility that we can build a movement that is healthier, as Hunt says, and displays, comes to the best parts of the church, fully recognize, much as Hunt has, when you work trying to get the church or clergy to do anything, you see the institutions, you see the underbelly. And I have worked with people who have had deep spiritual hurts. I've been hurt by the institutional church. The church is a reflection of society. Everyone, you probably, if you show up in a room and they're humans and you go there a couple times, something is going to happen. Right. And so we have to learn that that's okay, that there's a comfort. I think that this is the point of, it is not a litmus test. It is not a litmus test. And I think that for me is really important to express. I am not any more spiritually endowed for doing it or not doing it, and I think that it's like, we have to just make sure that we don't let that sort of hard thinking limit us. So for what I want to say is that it's the how. Let's work together and say how this works out. I think there's a lot more freedom and a possibility and inclusion when we frame the question in that way. So I'd love, us to sort of think, and what I want to continue to work in Ligare is like, let's ask good questions. I would love someone who hears this podcast who may not feel the same way, but like, is there anything that we shared today that makes you curious? A curiosity. Let's explore that together. Let's be in good dialogue. And we don't have to come to an agreement, but we can witness each other, and I can honor where you're at, you can honor where I'm at. Hopefully we both have a thread that we're making our way to ourselves, and through loving ourselves radically, we actually can love the divine better. And that's been the biggest change in my life. When I was able through this work to radically love myself, my ability to love God exploded a million times over. And I thought that somehow loving God was going to like have me love myself more. It was a reverse experience for me. The more I radically loved myself and felt at home, the more I had to give to the divine and to those that the divine loves, which is everyone. And so I think that is, we can find bridges. This is a bridge building opportunity as a conversation. So we can hold some space, hold some softness around it, and see where your edges are, and find someone to have a conversation with and explore it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being here and for engaging in this conversation. I feel like for me, it's a continuation of so many threads, but also the genesis of so many threads. And again, we didn't get to circle back to this, Jessica, but the embodied leadership, divine feminine, and sacred plant medicine. I feel like we talked around these subjects, but those are a couple threads I want to continue to explore.
We can have a second conversation anytime. Good. Excellent. Good. Yes. And what does embodied leadership inspired by psychedelics look like? So I tell you, I show up different, and as Hunt said, he shows up different. So yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah. That's the revolution from the inside.
Well, you both, thank you for being here. Thanks for taking the time to devote not only to the work that you do in public spaces, but also to the private work that you do that influences how you show up in the world. And thanks for bringing it here today.
Thank you, John. You're doing really good work. I mean, your podcast, it's a wealth of resources there.
Thanks, man.
You're doing amazing. You. And that's one little sliver of the work you're doing. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Controls your dreams, persuades your thoughts, governs your needs, governs your needs, governs your needs. all